How do you vanish into thin air in a quiet city like Cheyenne, Wyoming? That question, that single freezing question, ate a hole right through my life for 12 long years. Welcome to Detected Cold Cases, your daily dive into the world of unsolved mysteries, forgotten crimes, and chilling cases that still haunt investigators. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new revelation. I'm Detective Ethan Cole, and I've seen a lot of darkness in my time working cases for the Cheyenne Police Department, but nothing ever felt as cold, as baffling, as the disappearance of Sophie Miller. If you've ever felt that pit in your stomach when something just doesn't make sense, that feeling is what our entire city lived with for over a decade. Sophie was just 16 years old in 2003, a junior at East High. She was the kind of girl you might forget, not because she was quiet, but because she was just normal. She had decent grades, a small, close-knit group of friends, and a routine that was predictable down to the minute. On the morning of November 4th, 2003, she left her house just before 7:30, just like she did every school day. It was a crisp, clear day, the kind of day where the air hurts your lungs a little bit. She walked the same 3 blocks to the corner where she usually met her friend, Liam, to catch the bus together. But Sophie never made it to Liam. She simply disappeared between her front porch and that bus stop, a distance of maybe a few hundred yards on a residential street where everyone knew everyone else. Think about your own walk to work or school this morning. That short distance you cover without even thinking about it. Could someone just swallow you whole in that space? It's terrifying, isn't it? It makes you look over your shoulder right now, doesn't it? Keep that feeling close, because this story is about how something impossible became true, and how the answer was hidden in plain sight all along. When the call came into the station, it wasn't even a full missing person report yet, just a worried father, Mr. Miller, saying Sophie hadn't shown up to school. Parents worry. It happens all the time. But as the hours turned into the late afternoon, that worry turned to pure, shrieking panic. I was a young detective then, just a few years out of the academy, full of fire and the belief that every puzzle had a solution if you just worked hard enough. We threw everything we had at it. We interviewed every neighbor on that 3-block stretch. We checked every parked car, every yard, every shed. We brought in search dogs, but the trail went cold right at the edge of the Miller property. No struggle, no witnesses, no sign of a forced entry anywhere, not even a lost backpack or a dropped notebook. It was as if she had stepped off the face of the earth. The Millers, her parents, were destroyed. I remember sitting in their living room, looking at the photos of Sophie smiling, doing gymnastics, holding her dog. Mrs. Miller kept repeating, she wouldn't run away, she wouldn't run away, and Mr. Miller, a quiet man who worked at the local railway depot, just sat there, holding a mug of cold coffee, his eyes blank with shock. How do you tell people like that you have nothing? That your best efforts, the combined power of the entire police force, amounted to exactly zero? We couldn't. So we kept searching, even when the hope faded to a dull ache. For months, Cheyenne was covered in flyers. Sophie's face plastered on every lamppost, every store window. People started wearing little pink ribbons. It became one of those cases, the kind that becomes part of the city's identity, a wound that never truly heals. Every time a new piece of technology came out, every time a new detective joined the force, we pulled out the Sophie Miller file. We'd pore over the same reports, the same frustrating lack of evidence. We checked the national databases, spoke to other jurisdictions about similar cases, but nothing fit. Years passed. 2004, 2005, 2006. The fire I had at the start was replaced by a heavy, soul-crushing weight. Sophie's 18th birthday passed, then her 21st. The cold case unit eventually took over, and a few years later, I moved into that unit myself. I couldn't escape it. I didn't want to. I felt like I owed her parents, a piece of my life until I could bring her home, even if it was just to lay her to rest. The case file moved to the back shelf, a heavy, yellowing box, but for me, it was always on my desk. I'd pull it out on slow Tuesdays, sipping my coffee, just reading the original notes, hoping tired I would finally see the mistake a fresh one had missed. I remember thinking if she was taken, the person who took her had to be either a ghost or someone so close to the investigation, so confident, that they just blended into the background noise. It had to be someone who lived in our community, someone who knew Sophie's routine, who didn't raise any alarms. Think about the most trusted people in your life, the ones you see every day, the ones who smile and wave. Are you completely sure you know what secrets they hide? I wasn't. That question made me trust no one for a long time. Then came 2015, 12 years after Sophie vanished. The case had been officially cold for so long that most people outside the police department had stopped talking about it every day, though they never forgot the name. I was going through a stack of paperwork related to the probate of a recently deceased man named Walter Harrison. Mr. Harrison was a quiet, elderly man in his late 70s who lived alone a few blocks from Sophie's school, just on the other side of the bus route, in fact. He passed away from a sudden heart attack, and because he had no immediate family, the city was handling the sale of his small estate. During the clean-out, the workers found something strange. It was a wooden box, heavy and old, hidden deep in the back of a storage closet, bolted to the floor. It didn't look like a simple lockbox for jewelry or money. It looked homemade, sturdy, and definitely locked. When they couldn't open it, and because of the strange way it was hidden, the estate lawyers called us, just as a precaution. They just figured it might be some kind of war chest or family silver, but they wanted the police present when it was finally opened. I remember walking into that house, the air smelling of dust and old books. Mr. Harrison's life was laid bare, and it was a life that looked incredibly plain. What secrets could a retired accountant who spent his days gardening and listening to the radio possibly be hiding? I used a small, specialized tool to pry the hinges off the back of the box, avoiding the lock entirely. The lid creaked open, and the contents were, well, they were confusing. There were no jewels, no stacks of cash. Instead, there was a high school class ring, a small, cheap, plastic-cased disposable camera, the kind you buy at a convenience store, and a folded piece of yellowed notebook paper. That was it. I reached in and pulled out the class ring first. It was a silver ring, heavy, with the year '03 engraved on the side and the school initials, EHACE, East High School. My heart started beating hard, pounding in my chest, because Sophie was a junior there in 2003. Was this a massive coincidence, or was this the thread we needed? I ran the ring's specific serial number, found inside the band, through the old school records. The list of students who ordered that ring in 2003 was short. One of the names on the list, a girl who never picked up her ring, was Sophie Miller. I stood there in that dusty closet, holding a small piece of metal that belonged to a ghost, and the hair stood up on the back of my neck. I realized I wasn't holding just a clue. I was holding her life. But the biggest shock was the disposable camera. Who uses a disposable camera in 2015? This one was old, clearly from the early 2000s, maybe older. The list of dates and addresses written on the notebook paper was the other strange thing. The addresses were all local, Cheyenne spots, mostly vacant lots or storage sheds, and the dates spanned from late 2003 to early 2004. There were no notes, just a list. Was this a record? A log? The camera was the immediate next step. We rushed it to the evidence lab to have the film developed. You know the feeling when you're waiting for news that could change everything? It's paralyzing. For 2 hours, I paced, listening to the hum of the air conditioning. Finally, the lab tech, a woman named Sarah, brought the photos out. They were grainy, poorly lit, and the last 3 photos punched the air out of my lungs. They showed a small, windowless room, clearly a basement or a hidden space. The walls were painted a cheap pale blue, and there was a single threadbare couch. And on that couch, looking thin, a little older, but undeniably her, was Sophie Miller. She wasn't smiling. She looked tired, maybe even scared, but she was alive. 12 years later, and the biggest cold case in Wyoming history might not be a murder at all, but a kidnapping where the victim was still being held. The shock of seeing those photos, of seeing a Sophie who was no longer a child but a young woman in her late 20s, was immense. But the photos also provided the vital piece of information that finally cracked the case. One of the photos, taken at a low angle, accidentally showed the feet and lower legs of the person taking the picture, or standing nearby. It was just a sliver of cloth and shoe, but the shoes were unique. Old, heavy, dark brown work boots with a very distinctive worn patch on the left toe. The kind of boots someone who worked with their hands might wear. We immediately cross-referenced the photo with Mr. Harrison's property and his belongings. We found the boots in his garage. The same boots, down to the worn patch and the specific lacing pattern. Walter Harrison, the quiet old man, the retired accountant, was our captor. He had taken Sophie and kept her hidden. But wait, Mr. Harrison was dead. So, was Sophie still in that house? And if so, how had she survived for the past few weeks since his death? Did someone else know? The addresses on the notepad finally made sense. They weren't places the captor visited. They were places where he disposed of evidence over the years, places he used as drop sites to move things or materials. That list had stopped in 2004, meaning that whatever he had done to fully hide her, it was finished by then. Now we had a name, a motive which we still didn't fully understand, and a chilling confirmation. Sophie was not lost. She was locked away. The question shifted from, where is Sophie, to, where in Walter Harrison's property did he hide a person for 12 years? We brought in forensic teams and a specialized search unit to sweep Mr. Harrison's small, unassuming house. It was a nightmare. The house was spotless, everything exactly where it should be. The basement was finished, nothing seemed out of place. We spent 48 straight hours there. I was running on coffee and pure adrenaline, walking through the same rooms, trying to think like a criminal, trying to find the crack in the wall. The search hit every dead end imaginable. The house was silent. The basement was dry and smelled only of detergent. We were about to call off the intensive search, thinking maybe Sophie was moved right before Harrison died, when one of the younger guys on my team, a detective named Rossi, noticed something odd in the basement. Next to the furnace was a shelf stacked high with old paint cans. Standard stuff. But Rossi, bless his methodical heart, realized the cans were slightly offset from the wall by about a half-inch. Just enough space to suggest that the wall itself was thicker here than everywhere else. I knelt down and pushed against the section of drywall. It didn't budge. But when I tapped it, the sound was different, duller, more solid than the rest of the wall. We carefully cut into the drywall with a razor knife. And there it was. Not a hollow space, not a void, but a perfectly fitted, nearly invisible wooden door, expertly disguised and camouflaged with the fake paint cans. The door was secured with a magnetic lock that was wired to the main house's electricity. When the power was on, the lock was engaged. When the power was off, it was secured by a deadbolt. It was a masterpiece of hidden construction. We cut the power, and the magnetic lock clicked open. I grabbed the handle and pulled, and the door opened inward with a low, grating sound of old wood against a concrete floor. The air that rushed out was warm and stale. I stepped inside, gun drawn, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear the quiet. The room was small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with one single overhead light bulb burning. There was a bed, a small TV from the 90s, a collection of old books, and a little table with a nearly finished jigsaw puzzle. And sitting on that bed, looking up at the light, was a woman. She was thin, pale, her eyes wide and huge in the dim light. She looked like she hadn't seen the sun in a decade. And she was Sophie. I dropped my gun and fell to my knees, shaking. "Sophie," I whispered. "I'm Detective Cole. We're here to take you home. It's 2015. She didn't move for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice a dry whisper that felt ancient. "Walter's not coming back," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, almost of relief. She had known he was gone. She had been trapped in that room, alone, for days or maybe even a week, after her captor died outside her wall. Bringing Sophie out of that hidden room, out of that house and into the sunlight, was the single greatest moment of my career. The emotion, the blinding shock and relief, was overwhelming. The first 48 hours after we rescued her were focused entirely on her care, her mental and physical health. She was alive, but she wasn't free. She had been severely isolated and manipulated, clearly suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, where she saw her captor, Walter Harrison, as the source of her survival, not her terror. She was so scared, so broken, She couldn't give us a clear account of what happened. She called Walter Mr. Harrison and spoke of him as the man who brought her books and food. But we knew Harrison was the one who had taken her. The case was closed, right? We found the victim, we found the captor, even if the captor was already dead. The community could finally rest, even if the ending was bizarre. But the story, the truth, was about to take a turn that would shake the entire foundation of Cheyenne to its core. A few days later, a social worker, a specialist who knew how to talk to victims of long-term isolation, was able to get Sophie to share a detail that Walter Harrison's death had shielded from us. Sophie mentioned that in the last 2 years, Mr. Harrison had been struggling with his health, and someone else had started visiting regularly, bringing the food, the books, and sometimes just sitting and reading silently outside the hidden door. A new voice. A voice she knew well. He was helping Walter, she told the social worker, her eyes focused on a distant, invisible point. He told me he was Walter's helper. He said he was going to take care of me when Walter couldn't anymore. This helper had recently started taking care of her completely, bringing her a fresh supply of food and water just before Walter died, which is why she was still alive when we found her. The helper had been planning his takeover. Who was this person? A co-conspirator? Another random old man? The social worker gently asked Sophie to describe him, or even better, name him. Sophie paused, then spoke the name. And the name, the single name that dropped from her lips, was like a bomb going off in the quiet interview room. When the social worker called me with the name, I had to ask her to repeat it 3 times. I kept thinking, no, it's a mistake. It has to be a mistake. Because the name she said was David Reynolds. David Reynolds. Does that name mean anything to you? It wouldn't, unless you lived in Cheyenne during those dark years. David Reynolds was not just some guy. He was a pillar of the community, a friend of the Miller family, and more importantly, he was the head of the Find Sophie Foundation. He was the man who organized every single candlelight vigil, every search party, every fundraiser for the reward money. He was the one who was always on television, standing next to Sophie's devastated parents, giving tearful, emotional speeches about never giving up hope. He had literally spent 12 years leading the search for the girl he knew was hidden just blocks away. He had turned his criminal obsession into a charitable cause, using the search efforts as a perfect shield to watch the family, maintain his position of trust, and ensure the case stayed in the public eye, even as he visited her in secret. Could a person be so twisted, so arrogant, so utterly monstrous? I remember the shock rippling through the police station. We all knew David. He brought us coffee and donuts on the anniversary of Sophie's disappearance. He had been so helpful, so sympathetic, so sincere. We realized then that he hadn't just been helping Walter Harrison. He had likely been the mastermind all along. Walter Harrison was probably just a mentally frail person David had manipulated or blackmailed into using his property. Walter provided the locked room, but David provided the psychological control and the cover story. The list of dates and addresses in the box? David must have been cataloging his moves, the moments he felt in control of the investigation he was simultaneously leading. The true level of calculated evil here was breathtaking. We moved fast, but with absolute quiet. We couldn't afford a mistake. We found David Reynolds at his office, right near the center of Cheyenne. He was on the phone, likely organizing the next charity event. When I walked in, he smiled, a warm, reassuring, fake smile. "Detective Cole," he said, holding up a finger. "Just a minute. I'm securing a location for the memorial service. We simply have to give Sophie the send-off she deserves, even if she's finally home." He was still playing the hero, the grieving community father figure, even after we had rescued her. The sheer nerve of the man made my blood run cold. I didn't waste time. I placed the warrant on his desk and looked him right in the eye. "Mr. Reynolds," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "we need you to come down to the station. Sophie has told us everything." The smile vanished. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a ghost. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to run. He just looked at the warrant, then at me, and let out a small, tired laugh. It wasn't a funny laugh. It was the sound of a very long, very sick game finally coming to an end. 12 years, he whispered, shaking his head slightly. 12 years, and you found her. And I was so close. So close to taking over. He stood up, putting his hands out for the cuffs, without any struggle. The sight of the handcuffs clicking shut on the wrists of the man who had been the face of hope for a decade was the most shocking moment I have ever experienced as a cop. The news hit Cheyenne like a tsunami. David Reynolds arrested. The Find Sophie man was the villain. The man who comforted the parents was the one who had taken their daughter. The entire community was in disbelief, then horror, then rage. People who had worked alongside him, who had donated money and time to his foundation, felt sick to their stomachs. Mr. and Mrs. Miller, who had relied on David's strength and support for all those years, were broken all over again. Only this time the betrayal was far worse than the original loss. How could a parent ever trust anyone again after that? The case finally went to trial, and the details came out. David, who had known Sophie since she was a little girl because he was a volunteer coach at her middle school, had developed a twisted, controlling fixation on her. He had carefully planned the kidnapping, using Walter Harrison's nearby, unnoticed rental property as the perfect hiding spot. Walter was just a weak link, a way to keep his hands clean of the day-to-day upkeep until he could step in as Sophie's new savior after Walter passed. He was seeking ultimate control, not just over Sophie, but over the entire tragedy, over the Millers' grief, and over the city's attention. The end of this story isn't neat. Sophie came home, but she was deeply scarred. She spent years healing, relearning how to be free, how to trust the sun, the wind, and most of all, other people. David Reynolds was convicted of kidnapping and other charges, and he will spend the rest of his life in prison. He will never again stand in front of a camera and talk about hope. The Sophie Miller case, the one that everyone said would never be solved, taught me the most painful lesson about crime. The most dangerous people are often the ones you see every day, the ones who seem the most helpful, the most dedicated. They hide behind normalcy, behind good deeds, using the cover of light to execute the darkest of plans. Think about the face of David Reynolds, the man on the news, standing there with a pink ribbon pinned to his suit jacket, promising justice. And then, remember what he was hiding just blocks away. It's a terrifying lesson, and it's why cold cases need people who are willing to look past the obvious, past the pain, and ask the hardest question. Who benefits from a mystery? Who is still talking about it, years later a little too loud? I, Detective Ethan Cole, won't ever forget Sophie Miller, and I won't ever forget the cold, sickening feeling of arresting the man who had been bringing me donuts for 12 years. This story should make you pause, make you wonder about the people you trust. It should make you realize that the truth is often much stranger and far more hidden than any movie script could ever make it seem. This case proves that no matter how cold the trail, no matter how much time passes, justice is always waiting, sometimes in the most unexpected and terrifying way. Don't let the darkness win. If you have any information, no matter how small, about any missing person case, don't keep it to yourself. That small piece of information could be the high school ring, the photograph, the single clue that changes everything. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell right now so you don't miss our next case. Every view, every share, every comment helps keep the pressure on these cold, dark stories. We won't let these cases be forgotten. We are Detected Cold Cases, and we will never stop looking.